inshallah. And that is to begin with the word revelation, which is from the verb to reveal. Who knows the etymology? Does anybody know the etymology? In other words, what's the meaning? How would you crack open the word reveal? Not you. I'm sure we've talked about it.
Uncovered.
Uncovered, yes. So, you've hit it straight on. How would you break it up? How would you break up the word? Does anybody know? What's the bit? Because read, what is read? What is veal?
Something that was there before, then it's covered and then uncovered.
Yeah. Well, in essence, exactly right, because have we talked about that before? So veal is in fact basically from veil, and re can mean to do something again. It's got a whole series of different meanings, but one of them is to basically undo something or go back. So reveal is to take off the veil, to take away a veil, and it's a pretty universal experience of human beings that we have a feeling of being veiled. It's universal. It's not confined to religious people, but we have a feeling that we're not experiencing things as they are, and so we have a feeling of being veiled from how things are. Science certainly depends on such a feeling that how we ordinarily experience things is not necessarily how they are, and so we use these processes and procedures to try and unveil things. I had thought that, in fact, we use reveal in ordinary language in different contexts quite commonly. And the one, in fact, you find media headlines. You find media headlines where revelation, shocking revelation. And I did a bit of a search when I was preparing for this. If you give me a second, I will find an example of that, which I just did a quick Google search. The headline is, Police Chief's Body Faces Rebellion. The Guardian, 7th of February 2011, by Vikram Dodd, crime correspondent. Several police authorities refused to hand over subscriptions to ACPO in row over accountability and cuts. The ACPO president, Sir Hugh Ord, tried to head off criticism over the undercover units the body used to run. His call for radical reform comes after revelations of 7-year spy missions against environmental da-da-da-da-da-da. Yes? So this is a very, very common thing we're exposed to in the media, that the media reveals things to us. And I was reflecting on this process of revelation in the media, because they're usually dark revelations. They don't reveal, the media doesn't reveal wonderful, luminous things. Sometimes there's the kind of cheery story to round off a really bad news story. There'll be some cheery human interest story. But by and large, when they use revelation, they use it in terms of shocking revelations. We have shocking revelations about ex-President Bush's motives for going into Iraq, or Tony Blair's, or this kind of thing. I think all of you, if you picked up any newspaper and examined stories, you would come across very quickly the word reveal and revelation in this context. Now, this act of revealing is preceded by those same media building up a luminous, bright picture. We're presented with public figures and celebrities as larger than life and as luminous beings, largely. We talk about stars. So the media does both of these activities. It builds up these figures, and then suddenly it gives us shocking revelations. And there's a kind of an underlying supposition here that it's good for us to know these dark secrets. That somehow something good will happen if we're told this. And that it shares something with Freudianism. Because Freudian analysis was somehow that we carry these dark, dark secrets, and if we bring them to the surface, there will somehow be a redemption without a religion. So I just wanted to, I'm touching on a few things to show that we're very accustomed to the idea of revelation now. It's not purely a religious term. I was expecting to confine myself to looking at the media and then to look at science. I want to come quite quickly to science, but in my Googling, then I came across a reference to an El Greco exhibition of painting, and the sense that it was a revelation, that art somehow was also a revelation. So I'll touch on that a little bit, but I'll come back to that possibly. Then we come to science. And it's very common in writings by scientists and by science journalists. Not the same thing, but both scientists in their writings and science journalists often talk about how science reveals something. Now, revelation then is this sense of there's something that's not immediately, we don't normally experience it, we don't see it. And there's some process whereby these things we don't normally see are shown to us. So science, very commonly in its literature, refers to this revelation. It also, incidentally, very commonly refers to belief. Scientists say, we now believe. I did a search, and I actually looked up dark matter. I don't know how many of you are interested in cosmology, but in one way it fulfilled something I already knew was the case. But if you know about the understanding of the cosmology that the scientists have come up with, they basically say, well, now we basically understand. Then you find out about dark matter. Dark matter is basically the majority of the matter in the universe, and we have no idea what it is. And even when we account for that, we come up with dark energy. There's one other, and I can't remember what it's called. But scientists will say very often when they're mapping out these areas, we now believe that such and such. And let me give you this quote. This is from the New Scientist of the 17th of November 2007. Cosmic revelation heralds new way to view the stars. The article begins, the discovery that high-energy cosmic rays come from enormous black holes at the hearts of energetic galaxies might provide a novel way to image the sky. From the New Scientist. I'm not anti-science. This is not where I'm going with this at all. I'm not positing some conflict between religion and science. That's not where I'm going. So, if I have some tendency to do that, it's an old impulse, old prejudices that I'm trying very hard to overcome. So this is the third example of use of words like revelation and reveal that we're very accustomed to now, and we let them slip past us without really paying full attention to them. I'd like you, when you do read writings about science, then to observe that, be alert to that use of these words. Now, we mistakenly think that scientists make observations, and then they reflect on the observations and they look for a theory. You see? But in fact, there's now a very developed set of disciplines which are the philosophy and history of science. And it's quite clear that this is not the case. This is not what science does. Science has an outline of what it thinks is there, the scientist has, and he then proceeds to, he advances a hypothesis and he tests it against experiment. But in fact there's a hidden set of hypotheses. Not so hidden really, but for most of us they're hidden because, partly because Newton, when he wrote the Principia, his major work, he concealed that. He wrote the Principia in such a way as if, having made these observations, he pondered on them and then he came to certain conclusions. But the reality was he had a prior agenda which he was looking for, and he tested it against the observations, and he came up with his outline that dominated several centuries of scientific discovery. One of the best introductions to this, and one of the most amusing, is from George Bernard Shaw. And George Bernard Shaw, once in London, when Albert Einstein came to visit London, he was asked to speak in honor of Albert Einstein at a dinner in London. And he said, on occasions like this, and if you're asked to speak in honor of great men, for example, he said, if I was asked to speak in honor of Napoleon Bonaparte, there are many things I could say about him, but perhaps the most important thing I could not say, which is that it would have been better for the human race if he had never been born. Which took the wind out of his listeners. You can find this on YouTube, in fact, this fragment of the speech. He said, because Bonaparte was of a species of men who make empires. He said there's another type of man, and he makes universes. And when he makes a universe, his hand is unsullied by the blood of any man. And of course, people were caught off guard by Bernard Shaw talking about Napoleon shedding blood. And then when they saw he was going where they thought he was going, they were very relieved, and they applauded him very highly for this. And he said, Ptolemy made a universe, and it lasted for 1,400 years. He said, Newton made a universe, and it lasted for 400 years. Einstein has made a universe, and I can't tell you how long it will last. So it's a very interesting speech, and Shaw is a very amusing speaker, but a very profound speaker. You mustn't be deceived by his wit and his humour, from the fact that he's a very insightful man, and he's also one of the people who's got one of the very, very best essays on evolution, which was one of the prefaces to one of his plays, which was called, I think, Beyond Methuselah. So, are you with me? I'm not leaving you too far behind, I hope. Yeah, are we all right? Yeah? What we call science, scientists will tell the story as if it began with the Greeks, etc., etc. What we call science today began with Galileo. It began with Galileo, then Descartes, then Newton. Really, that's it. Newton fleshed out what Galileo did. So it was something quite different. Quite different. They say that the old scientists, before this time, they wanted to know, why does it happen? What is it? What's going on? And with this science that is characterized by mathematics, the scientists began to sacrifice those questions. They began to no longer ask what's going on and why is it going on, because they had a new tool, which was this mathematics, which allowed them to describe with great power and precision what was going on. The mathematics allowed the description of what was going on. Now, there's two elements in which mathematics comes in. There's what we're familiar with, which is numbers, equations, geometry, etc., etc., etc. But there's another process which is mathematics, and that is what Euclid did. Euclid came upon the inheritance of Greek geometry, and he summed it up and expressed it in a rigorous form. And what he did was he defined the terms, he expressed axioms. Axioms are self-evident truths that don't need a proof. On the basis of his definition of terms and his statement of axioms, then he began with a hypothesis. Yeah? And if he could prove it, the hypothesis became a theorem. We say today, many people say, oh, it's only a theory. Actually, a theory is something that's been proven in this type of thinking. Yes? Or in mathematics, called a theorem. So, this is specifically for mathematics. But in the modern era, a number of people were... It's really to do with the collapse, the beginning collapse of Christianity and a rebellion against Christianity, and people were reaching for some other tool of thought. They were reaching for some other way to reach certainty. And this process, the philosophers took it from Euclid. Many of them did it, but one of the most significant is Descartes. And the reality is that this process of defining your terms, stating what you consider to be self-evident truths, and then advancing a hypothesis, and then proving it carefully, this has tremendous power in it. Specifically in mathematics, where the mathematicians endeavored to be absolutely what they called rigorous. They were devastatingly honest and sincere, and very, very careful to make sure that they were not assuming anything. And in the history of mathematics, there were at least two major crises where they found absolutely fundamental flaws that basically meant they had to start again from the beginning. But where it affects us is when it comes into the sciences, and when it comes even further into things that affect us in many, many other ways, apart from just basic science. So, when Newton had the great success he had, people were overwhelmed by Newton's work. And everybody began to try and model their sciences on what Newton had done. And this went into economics. Economics was invented as a science. Many of the academics at the time said, this is not a science. This is not a science. It's not rigorous. It's affected us today. For example, we were talking earlier in conversation about the American Declaration of Independence. Who knows how that begins? Who can tell me the first words of the American Declaration of Independence? Because it's not just an American document, you see.
We the people. It's that we the people.
I don't think it's we the people. If I remember rightly, it's not that. Does anybody know? Because this is a document.
Is it something about self-evident truths?
Yes.
Is right.
Exactly. We hold these truths to be self-evident. So what does he say? What's he doing here? What are they doing? The founding fathers, or the authors of the American Declaration of Independence. So it is this process we've been talking about, because these are his axioms. These are his axioms, and he's making they're building a new order. You see? They're building a new order. And that order has spilled down to us. My brother as a French gentleman, if you study the French Revolution, how do you say it in French? The philosophes. Is that right? The philosophers in French. The philosophes. Yeah? If you read the history before the French Revolution, who's there? It's the philosophes. Yes, the philosophers. So this thing has moved from mathematics into the sciences, into physics, then it's moved into all the sciences, and now it's moved into the political realm. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Yes? All men are created equal. If you examine this rationally, it's simply not true. It's certainly not self-evidently true. You know, we're not equal. No, you can't find two men who are equal. But this is something that we've grown accustomed to in the sciences. These things that are appealingly, they seem appealing enough, but if you really examine them critically, they're not true. What is Newton's first law of motion?
Every action has a reaction.
What's that?
Every action has a reaction.
Is that the first one?
That's the third one.
Okay. You might be right. I'm talking about the second one.
F is equal to MA. F is equal to MA.
No. Well, actually, Newton didn't call them laws. He called them axioms, you see. He said an object. Who knows?
Stays in its position of rest or uniform motion.
Yes. Unless?
Unless compelled by another force.
Yes. Unless acted upon by another force. But of course, he wrote it in Latin. But that's it. Now, the German philosopher Heidegger said, where is this object? Where is it? Where? Because there isn't anything in the whole universe that's at rest or in uniform motion. There's no such thing. There isn't a single object that we know of in the whole universe that's like that. But this is the axiom. Now, this isn't a criticism of science, because on this basis, you can throw an object to space and get it to Jupiter, which is an astonishing achievement, you see. So we're not criticizing science, but we're saying there's something astonishing going on here. There's something absolutely counterintuitive is going on here. I want to look, I've gone to axioms, but because it's my pet interest, my hobby. But recently I've taken a step back and I'm looking at the definition of terms. The definition of terms. And that's really kind of the key thing. And because we've seen the scientific consequences. The scientific consequences have technological consequences. The technological consequences have the global consequences, which are now being thrown into considerable doubt by skeptics, but of global warming, all of these things, ecological devastation, etc., etc., etc. So this is not just head stuff. This is head stuff. We're doing this because we're concerned about our situation as human beings. So the definition of terms, this is a fundamental thing. We define a term. Now, for our age, what better term than freedom? Yes, so I looked up what would you say is the definition of freedom? Because George Bush, what did he say? The microphones were on and he turned to, I think, what was the woman who was his foreign secretary? What was her called?
Rice.
Yeah, Condoleezza Rice. Yeah, and he said, well, let freedom grow, or something like that. You see? So it's this banner. Everything is sold in freedom. Edward Bernays, the inventor of what's it called? Public relations. Yes? He found he could sell cigarettes to half of the population under the banner of freedom. Everything is sold as under freedom. So this is a very important term. What is freedom? How would you define freedom? It's what I'm just asking you for what the ordinary definition of freedom. I shouldn't really test you. the dictionary, this is the dictionary that comes with my Apple computer, which is quite a good one. The power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. So that's all right. What's the root of freedom? What's the root of free? If we're talking about the root meaning. Very, very few people know this, and Haj Khalil knows, and he's not allowed to stay.
No restraint.
No,
Liberation?
no. It's nothing to do with these things, you see? Nothing to do with them. Because the language has grown so far away. You will not believe it. This is from the etymological dictionary. It's also from this. So it's I think it's the New American Dictionary. Yeah? Origin, Old English, frio is an adjective, freon, verb, of Germanic origin, related to such and such and such and such, and it's related to the German frei. So the Germans say Freiheit. Freiheit is freedom. From an Indo-European root meaning to love. To love. Freedom comes from a root to love. And it's related to the word friend. Friend. Yes? Because in the family, because throughout history there have been free people and there have been slaves. The family, the free people were dear. They were beloved. They were the beloved, you see. So free is connected to love. And my wife is Danish, and in the Danish language, the verb free, you say in Danish at free, to free, is to propose marriage. Is to propose marriage. Now, this illustrates exactly what I'm saying. If we define our terms, we would define it as the power or right to act, speak, or think as we wish, without restraint. That's a definition, you see. But where do these words come from? They've come to us already with meanings. In defining them, we ignore them. And then by proceeding on the definition, without examining what does this word mean? What does it mean? Then it has political consequences. So we're in a funny age, because people are talking seriously about imposing democracy. How can you impose democracy? Entire nations say, we don't want this democracy, and people say, no, we're going to impose it on you. So this is more than just cynicism. It's more than cynicism. It relates to this issue. It relates to this issue of something very profound in our thinking. Yes? Something that's gone wrong, that's put us in this position. So we'll come back to our sciences, and we'll get a bit closer to the second topic, because we had revelation and the neuro-physiological self. Yes? So this process that began with Galileo, Descartes, and Newton, and then all the scientists of all the disciplines, they wanted to take this power that had been revealed and shed its light on their own disciplines. Then it conquered all of them, biology, all of these things. There's no doubt, the extraordinary results that came from this. But they're paradoxical results. We're more and more accustomed to knowing about the paradoxical results of quantum theory. And this was, my background was in mathematics and physics, so this is something I've thought about for a very, very long time, for many, many years, and it's very interesting and instructive. This thing that matter, first of all, it's full of nothing, and it can be a particle, and it can be a vibration. You see, we're dealing with something that we're better to admit this is utterly paradoxical, because Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, these men they accepted that they were dealing with something that was completely paradoxical. They said, Niels Bohr said to Heisenberg about a group of the logical positivists who came from Vienna. They asked Niels Bohr in 1953 to explain quantum theory, and he explained quantum theory to them, and they said, thank you very much, and went away. Niels Bohr said to Heisenberg, I don't think they understood anything. I don't think they understood a word. Because if you're not stunned by quantum theory, if you're not thrown into confusion and puzzlement, you haven't understood anything. This is the men who got it, you see. This is the men who got it. So what we think of as matter is just a great paradox. What we thought was solid and real, why did they hunt the atom? They hunted the atom because Democritus said there's the void and there's the atom, and the atom is solid, hard. Yeah? But they chased it because that would imply that the universe was real in some way. But they chased the atom and they knocked it to bits, and then it just became utterly paradoxical. So we're again at this situation of our everyday experience of reality doesn't match up to this thing that science reveals. Science reveals. So many sciences, Heisenberg regarded that part of science as closed. Heisenberg died in the 70s, and he really regarded it as having reached its conclusion. He said it shows it's possible to reach the end in a finite number of steps, the end of a science. So all of these sciences reached they reached their conclusions, and astonishing conclusions. And it was and is widely regarded that there's only one citadel left to conquer. And what do you think that citadel is? What is the citadel that science has yet to conquer?
Spirit.
Yeah. Consciousness, spirit. You're in the zone. Not just spirit, but the very fact of consciousness. Scientists know all of the sciences. There's a whole group of sciences that are converging on consciousness and saying that, what is this thing? How is this thing? And it's regarded as the last citadel. The book that has meant a lot to me, which I brought with me, and this is by this man called Antonio Damasio, who's a neurophysiologist, and it's called The Feeling of What Happens. He's better known for the book that he wrote before this, which is called Descartes' Error. Descartes' Error. So this is the last citadel that materialist science is struggling with. These people are utterly sincere, honest truth seekers. They're looking for something, and they're admitting that this is a great puzzle. When I was first interested in this many years ago, I bought a little book, paperback book. It was called The Brain. It was a popular book on the recent research. And when I found out it was basically accounts of experiments on dogs and monkeys, which was just torture, I thought, well, I don't think I need this knowledge, and I left it. But in between, other things happened. There were other things happened, and it produced this very, very interesting study by a wide range of, not just one scholar, but a wide range of scholars. And in fact, I was rereading parts of it just on the way here. And he's quite open, Antonio Damasio, which I had not remembered. In fact, he's quite open, saying that he still doesn't think that the citadel of consciousness is going to be conquered just quite right now. But there's a very, very interesting picture that he paints of what I call the neuro-physiological self. Are we all right? I'm not sure if were you prepared for, or was there a hint in my title that this is where we were going? I don't want to overload you. Can we proceed?
Yeah.
I just need this break myself, actually. I'm not really up to giving a summary of what he says, but as far as I've understood his prior book, Descartes' Error, which is reflected in the findings of this book, centers around the very possibility of objective thought. And if we say objective thought, we're really saying thought that's not moved by emotion or prejudice or preconceptions. Specifically emotion. And I'd say if there's one thing that characterizes science, it's that need to state things without emotion. Because we think our emotions are not to be trusted. Basically, and this is not a modern thing. It's a very old realization. When the Greeks wrote their tragedies, the Greek playwrights wrote their tragedies, they were confronted with the mess that is human emotion that produces such disasters. They were appalled at what goes on in the nuclear family. They wrote their stories about kings and queens and all of these things, but they were really writing about the family. Oedipus Rex by whatever his name is. Who's read Oedipus Rex? It's a very amazing play, but he's really talking about the family and what goes on in the family. And the Greeks were very sincere and earnest people. They were worried about the family and then the political consequences on society, of kingship and these things. And they looked earnestly at these matters. So in Plato's Republic, which I never finished reading, but there you can hear Socrates and the people around him, they're earnestly reflecting these matters. And they're saying, what are we going to do about the family? It's a disaster. And the answer, of course, was more disastrous, but it was very sincere, because they said, let every man and woman hold each other in common, and it's nobody's business who's with who. And let the state take the children away from the parents at birth. So let every man and woman look at every child and think, maybe that's my child. And let every child look at every adult and say, maybe that's my parents. Yeah? A horrendous suggestion, but it came from somewhere very sincere, because they realized that the family was potentially a disastrous thing, and very often practically a disastrous thing. How did I get to? This doesn't help at all. Yes, I was talking about Damasio, and yes, and is this the reason why scientists wanted to have a thought without emotion, why they wanted to have pure thought? Very much goes back to Descartes. When you look at the biographies, you often find people who are not entirely sympathetic humanly. Newton is not entirely all there humanly. There's something lacking. Yes? And the scientists would say, this is none of your business, because science is about pure thought. The biography of the scientist is irrelevant. So we just note for the moment that you don't always find the most admirable specimens of humanity when you look at scientists. So there's this attempt to think purely and objectively, if anything characterizes science. And this science comes finally to this we call it a siege of the citadel of consciousness. And what they find out at the siege is that you can't have a thought without a feeling, without an emotion. It doesn't happen. So this is something utterly paradoxical. It's like Heisenberg's paradox of matter. We're left with a paradox. You can't sum it up in an easy way. Because this admirable objective science objectively shows that it's impossible. So we're left with I'm not saying this from an anti-scientist perspective. And we find people, I've mentioned Heidegger. Now Heidegger comes from the philosophical tradition, from Descartes' own. Descartes is a mathematician and scientist, and he's a philosopher. So we've come through the Newtonian heritage from Descartes, and now when we come to Heidegger, we come through the philosophical inheritance of Descartes. Who knows what that famous thing that almost everybody knows about, what Descartes said? What did he say? What was this thing he said in Latin? Yes. Who said that? Okay. Cogito ergo sum. And some people say cogito sum. Cogito sum. Yeah? Cogito, I think. Sum, ergo means therefore. Sum, I am. You see? So Descartes grounded everything in his thinking on this idea that the one thing we're clear about is I am. But now the sciences have just laid siege to the citadel of I am. And Heidegger did the same thing, but from a completely different perspective. Heidegger tried to open up this thing of what is this I? Who am I? Yes? In a very, very interesting way. That led to a lot of interesting things. It led to a kind of analysis, a therapy for ill people that's much more interesting, say, than Freudian therapy or behaviorism and these types of things. So we have these figures. We have Gödel. You know who Gödel is. Gödel is the mathematician. He does for mathematics what Heisenberg does for physics. Because the mathematicians were proceeding on this basis. They were trying to establish, by this process, an edifice of absolutely sure knowledge. Anybody who's even opened Russell's Principia Mathematica will maybe understand a little bit of how he tried to do that. It's an appalling and erudite book, after which he realized he was completely wrong. So Gödel showed it couldn't be done. Gödel basically showed you cannot make a completely impregnable edifice of arithmetic, just arithmetic. Goethe had been there before. Goethe was early. Goethe saw it and he said, this isn't it. Goethe actually tried to make a science that was based on observing things and reflecting about them. All of this comes about because of a crisis within Christianity and Judaism. In the Renaissance you have a crisis, and that bursts out in the Reformation. But it's much more than just corruption in the church, but you have a crisis. And you have a situation where, because of the genuine corruption in the Catholic Church at the time, people struck out. Luther and Calvin, they struck out with trying to reform Christianity. The scientists and the artists and the musicians tried in their own ways to raise the banner of truth. Because the Catholic Church, at that point, for a variety of reasons, had come to define truth by fiat, by command, and by prohibition. And that the human soul rejects that. The human soul rejects having truth defined by command, defined by the threat of being burnt alive if you go against it. So this is